When I was a small girl growing up in Western Australia, our family, like most of our neighbours, would pack up the family car and head off on a road trip for holidays. We would usually drive to an outback place like Kalgoorlie Boulder, but we also went to an old settlement town named York. Even saying its name now sends shivers down my spine. It must be almost 40 years since I stayed there. The memories will never leave me. York is a beautiful place with a long history and lovely old homes and buildings. It must have once been a bustling place with nothing but red dirt all around for miles. It would have been a thriving regional centre in its heyday. York is 100 kilometres or so east of Perth and hosted a festival of sorts during the late 70s and early 80s when we visited. My mother was a puppeteer and would put on a show there. While in York, we stayed at the old hospital, a rather imposing, large, but lovely building surrounded by gum trees. It was turned into a hostel after being discontinued as a medical facility. Many Western Australian children and adults stayed there during that time. The Old York Hospital was built in 1894 to accommodate the increasing number of ill prospectors from the goldfields. It stopped operation as a hospital in 1963, and it wasn't until 1976 that the National Trust acquired these buildings. I don't recall, though, ever witnessing any wildlife around the structure, which is unusual considering its location. Not so unusual if you've felt the eerie aura of the property. Allow me to describe the building a little. It's a 2-storey stone structure with an annex added later as a maternity ward. It was this part of the building that housed the sleeping quarters for later visitors. There was a large dormitory on the second floor of the main building that was later made out of bounds to visitors. It was on this second floor that, if I recall correctly, we slept before it was cordoned off to the public. The kitchen, dining and a small sitting room for adults were attached to the main building. Inside, a small hallway led into the kitchen, which also contained a walk-in pantry at the far end. The kitchen window was high above the sink, and if you could have looked out of it, you would have seen across a yard to a small building used at one time as a morgue. A wooden staircase outside the back door led up to the second floor onto a veranda. There were double doors that led into the building, the main ward having 4 large old windows facing onto the veranda. Many of the rooms were boarded up or kept locked. The caretaker's cottage was some 20 or more metres from the annex. Although the building itself was surrounded by many lovely trees, I never saw any birds there. Yet there are plenty of birds in the township of York. The only account of there ever being birds seen on the property were a dead one hanging in the window of the shower block in the boys' dormitory once, and another dead bird lying on the grass outside the museum, which is located next door. This building has a long history of hauntings and strange occurrences, but we didn't know that as children. My father was a great storyteller and took special delight in retelling spooky stories from whatever historic site we were camping at, even if he stretched the truth and made them up on the spot. We all loved Dad's ghost stories, and he was good at it. When my dad told us about the ghostly and tormented matron of the Old York Hospital, we presumed this to be yet another of his tall tales and true. Although spooked from his recounts of how the matron still walked the halls and did her ghostly rounds, We didn't think anything would actually happen. Remember, we had heard a million ghostly stories and never had anything untoward happen. This was about to change. My brother and I, being the youngest, had a large dorm room all to ourselves, as it seemed not too many folks were keen on spending a night at the York Hospital, even back then. I don't remember feeling anything but the usual jitters we got after one of Dad's spooky bedtime stories as we settled into our bunks. My brother and I got on about as well as any brother and sister did, and we were really excited to have such a large room with several sets of bunk beds in all to ourselves. We made a point of choosing beds as far apart from each other as possible. After tucking us in for the night, my mum and dad left us and went downstairs to enjoy some time alone before they would also retire for the night. My brother and I spent a little time hurling insults and joking with each other before we started to drift off. It was then that we heard the footsteps marching down the wooden floorboards towards our own room. At first we thought it must be our parents coming to check on us, but we hadn't heard the creepy old staircase. Then the footsteps stopped for a moment, still down the long hallway. Then they started again, progressed a little closer, and then they stopped. It was like whoever was walking down the hallway was stopping at every room on the second floor before proceeding to the next. Again, the footsteps started their clip-clop, then stop. This was starting to give me the creeps. And being the annoying little sister I was, I whispered and asked my brother if he could hear them. He said he could. He bet it was just my dad trying to scare us in one of his pranks that my mum would no doubt growl at him for later. Again the footsteps started, then after a short walk stopped, each time getting further along the old ward, towards the room we were in at the end of the hall. As the footsteps got gradually louder, they sounded as if they had stopped outside the room before ours. I could take it no more. I forced my frozen little body to run across the large room and stood at my brother's bedside to find him laying with his eyes wide open. He didn't say a thing, but pulled back his covers so I could climb in with him. We lay there, both breathing hard, but not making a sound, when the footsteps stopped at our doorway. I lay there hanging on tight to my older brother, waiting for some ghostly apparition to appear. But it didn't. There was a long, quiet pause before the footsteps started receding down the hallway again. This time they did not stop at every room. They just constantly clip-clopped on the wooden floor all the way up the hall until we could hear them no more. Had it been the ghostly matron doing her rounds dutifully even after her tragic death? Or was it my dad's idea of a fun prank to play on his children? We had both decided it must have been Dad trying to spook us, and I returned to my own bed. But this time I chose a bunk much closer to my brother. We eventually fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning we relayed what had happened to us, expecting to see my dad's smirk grow on his face. Instead, my mum and dad's face turned pale, and they both said they had not left each other's sight all night, and that no one had been upstairs except the two of us. My mum was adamant it must have been something explainable, like tree branches brushing the building in the wind, or creaky old wooden joints of a well-worn antique building. I know it wasn't any of those things. The footfall was too purposeful, the tread and the gait clearly discernible. The way they stopped and started on the journey down the hall until they reached the last room, before returning without pause to wherever they had come from at the other end of the hall. I think the ghostly matron did her rounds that night and checked in on two very frightened children laying silently still in the room at the bottom of the hall. I've since been fascinated with stories from this old building. I happened to stay there a few times over the course of my childhood, on school camps and with my family. But we never returned after our experience with the ghostly matron. I remember there was a small cluster of large old trees not far from the building at the back of the premises. It had a really strange vibe to it. Even as a child, I always felt like I was being watched, even when no one was in sight. I later found out that my dad hadn't made up the tales he recounted to us about the old York Hospital. Apparently, a former matron from the 1920s was quoted as saying, "There was something terrifying about the room upstairs. The hospital staff refused to go up there alone, and even when the ward was full of patients, the nurses always made their rounds in pairs." The legend says that during the gold rush, the hospital's matron was raped, tortured and murdered in the building, and ever since has haunted the upper level of the old hospital. I don't know if that's true, but having read more than one account, I find it hard to believe just one ghostly matron could be responsible for all the unusual and frankly terrifying supernatural goings-on associated with this old property. One truly disturbing account happened in 1980. Members of a children's athletic club and their adult supervisors stayed for a week in the hostel. As early as the first night, these visitors suspected something was strange about the old York Hospital. The children and adults began to hear audible sounds of moaning, seemingly coming from inside the walls. The adults investigated the sound, but could not locate the source of the deep moaning, guttural groaning, and at times shrill screams. The morning of the second day at the old York Hospital proved to be even more alarming to them, as two women were preparing breakfast for the group. A large porcelain pitcher was seen levitating in mid-air, as if some ghostly hand was carrying it towards them, only to drop and smash right at their feet. Not wanting to frighten the children, I suspect, the women cleaned up the mess, and even though they were spooked, they continued with breakfast for the children. Breakfast was eaten and enjoyed by the children without incident, until two of the youngest children in the group, a pair of little girls, were in the hallway, downstairs near the kitchen door, when they were disturbed by an unseen entity who was anything but friendly. This account still gives me the creeps, and is one of the most horrifying ghostly encounters I have heard relayed by reliable witnesses. One of the little girls let out a blood-curdling scream and hysterically started screaming to anyone who might help, hold me, I can't sit down. Stop them, stop them." Her little body was then seen to lift up and fly across the hall. Despite her little friend's attempts to hold on to her dress, she was then thrown with great force against a glass-panelled door at the end of the hall. I must note, having seen this very door in real life, the glass was thick. Yet something paranormal was able to lift and throw her little body with so much force that it entirely shattered the thick glass panel. The impact was so hard that it gashed her little arm to the bone when she tried to protect her head with her hand. She was rushed to the hospital and stitched back together to stop the bleeding. On the second night, the moaning resumed, beginning late in the afternoon and not ceasing until morning. The next morning, a boy went into shock when he witnessed a partial human figure materialize, seemingly out of thin air, with its hand on the doorknob of the now broken door. At this point, some of the adults were becoming seriously concerned. The intensity of the haunting continued to escalate, especially in the afternoon. One of the adults was kicked hard in the back by an invisible force, so hard they flew forward and into the ground. Doors began to slam shut onto people, injuring them as they walked through doorways. Whatever entity was lurking in the Old York Hospital, it wanted them gone, dead or alive. One woman was disturbed as she suddenly felt the sharp pain of invisible needles. These needles were felt to be injecting themselves into the woman's flesh. And then there was the stench of rotting meat that filled the building during their stay. The stink was so bad at times the group were retching and heaving. Although the smell was not smelled outside, inside there was no escape from it. The rotting smell intensified as time went on. By the end of the third day, both adults and children were sleeping in one room to protect themselves from their invisible attackers. The mournful, otherworldly moans and screams repeated again and could not be excused as the wind outside, nor could it have been old pipes sounding off. On the fourth day, the violent presence seemed to be focused in the downstairs area, near the stairway, in a room known as the dying room. The dying room had been bolted shut and padlocked when the group arrived, but by the third day had unlocked itself. The caretaker of the building tried to downplay the group's experiences. He had no explanation for how the dying room had unlocked itself. He did agree to provide a dog to help guard the group, a large ridgeback, being concerned, I suppose, about the reputation of the hostel for future visiting groups. But the dog the caretaker provided flat out refused to enter the structure. The group's horrific experiences were thoroughly investigated, and the witnesses were found to be very credible. Many visitors and workers have reported being grabbed, thrown and stuck by needles by unseen presences. If you only feel an eerie presence or goosebumps or have the feeling you are being watched, you are one of the fortunate ones. The maternity ward is renowned for paranormal activity, especially at certain times late at night, when the sounds of ghostly babies crying and otherworldly women moaning can be heard. When it was used as a hostel, many reported seeing apparitions, ghostly voices speaking in their ears. So I am sure this old property is haunted by more than just the long-dead matrons stalking the deserted halls. I wonder if my father ever knew that the truth was much more frightening than any scary story he could tell me. The building is now in the hands of private owners who are reportedly turning it into a bed and breakfast. This has been rumoured for many years and is still yet to become reality. I feel my family was fortunate to escape with just our footsteps in the hall and being watched. considering the terrible events that would follow only a few years afterwards. Dean Caswell, if you're listening, I hope you enjoyed a spooky Australian story narrated just for you. You should all check out Dean's channel, In the Trenches with Kaz, and I would like to give a special thank you to Anthony Justice from the Haunted Spots Library blog for the kind use of their material, and would encourage you all to pop over to his blog and check out some more Australian hauntings. Links to In the Trenches with Kaz and the Haunted Spots Library blog are in the description. Thank you for listening.